Here's a question that might surprise you. What if the word we use every Sunday doesn't actually mean what we think it does? The word church. You've heard it your entire life. Maybe you grew up going to one. Maybe you left one. But here's the thing. The word church doesn't come from the Greek word the apostles used. Not even close. The New Testament writers used the word ekklesia, a Greek term meaning assembly or gathering of people. It was political, it was social, it described a community called together for a purpose. But church, that's a completely different word with a completely different origin. So where does church come from? It traces back to the Greek word kyriakon, meaning belonging to the Lord or the Lord's house, not a people, a place, a building. Already we've shifted from community to real estate. But how did a word that means house of the Lord end up replacing ekklesia in our English Bibles? The answer takes us through centuries of linguistic evolution, political power, and one translator's execution. Let's start in the early centuries of Christianity. At first, ekklesia meant exactly what it said, a gathering of believers. But as Christianity grew and became institutionalized, the word began to shift. Christians started meeting in dedicated buildings, and some Greek-speaking believers began using the phrase kyriakon doma, meaning the house of the Lord, to describe those spaces. Now entered the Germanic tribes. These were the ancestors of the English people, and at this time, English didn't exist yet. When these tribes encountered Christianity through Roman and Greek missionaries, they borrowed the word kyriakon into their own language. They called it kyriaka. Over centuries, as these tribes migrated and settled in what would become England, the word evolved. Kyriaka became syris in Old English, then kyrche in Middle English, and eventually church in Modern English. By the time English-speaking Christians talked about their faith, they weren't using a word that meant gathering. They were using a word rooted in buildings and sacred spaces. But here's where it gets interesting. When William Tyndale translated the Bible into English in the 1520s, working directly from the original Greek manuscripts, he made a very deliberate choice. He translated ekklesia as congregation or assembly. He used words that pointed to people, not places. He refused to use the word church. Why? Because Tyndale knew it wasn't faithful to the original text. In fact, in his translation, the word church appears only twice, and both times it refers to pagan temples, not the followers of Jesus. Think about that. The word we use today to describe Christian communities was, in Tyndale's view, a word for pagan worship spaces. And for this, among other things, William Tyndale was executed, strangled and burned at the stake in 1536. But the story doesn't end there. Decades later, England broke from the Roman Catholic Church. King James I commissioned a new English Bible, the King James Bible, and he gave his translators 15 strict rules. One of them was this: the word ekklesia must always be translated as church. Why would he mandate that? Some historians say it was about control. Others argue he simply wanted translators to use familiar language, words the English people already knew. After all, church was the common term. Assembly and congregation sounded revolutionary, radical, reformer language. But here's what's fascinating. The reformers weren't just trying to translate the Bible into English, they were trying to restore Christianity to what it looked like in the first century. And what the first century believers had wasn't church, it was ekklesia. The King James Bible became the most influential English Bible in history. And because of one royal decree, we've inherited a word that fundamentally changes how we read the New Testament. We read church and we think buildings, institutions, Sunday services, clergy. But when Paul wrote to the ekklesia in Corinth or Ephesus, he was writing to people, a movement, a living, breathing community. One word, but it shaped centuries of Christian practice. It influenced how we organize, how we gather, how we lead, how we think about authority and structure, all because a Greek word meaning assembly was replaced with an English word meaning the Lord's house. So here's the question: what does this mean for us today? If the word we've used for centuries doesn't actually reflect what the apostles were talking about, how much of what we practice is built on that same linguistic drift? And maybe more importantly, what would it look like to recover what was lost?